December 31st, 1994. Russian armored columns entered Grozny without resistance. The generals expected a swift sweep, but the next 60 hours turned into an unprecedented slaughter. By 1 in the afternoon, the 131st Maikop Brigade reached the Grozny railway station. They parked their tanks in dense rows. The streets stood dead. At the city limits, red spray paint on a metal road sign had already delivered the message: "Welcome to hell." Why did the avenue seem absolutely deserted? The city was preparing to snap the trap shut. The armor had rolled through the void like a parade. The defenders watched the columns in pure shock. Streetlights still burned in the winter overcast. The yellow glow of empty apartments reflected on the cold steel of the halted tanks. The command felt confident. They aligned the machines bumper to bumper on the open asphalt. A fatal spatial geometry. Because they ignored preliminary reconnaissance, the vanguard drove blindly into a mathematically perfect tactical anomaly. The brigade stopped exactly between the external and internal rings of the defensive network around the presidential palace. A perfect 360-degree kill zone. Soviet apartment blocks flanked the concrete basin of the square. Enemy fighters already held the basements and roofs in front, behind, and on both flanks. The commanders saw nothing. Nobody secured the perimeter. Nobody occupied the adjacent structures. The infantry remained sitting inside their armored vehicles. This isolated grouping at the railway station ended up there due to the initial failure of the assault's geometry. Command originally drafted a 4-vector strike. 4 armored columns had to breach the city limits simultaneously and converge on the center. That was the blueprint. Execution immediately broke the design. Friendly artillery struck one advancing brigade. The unit retreated. A parachute regiment outright refused the attack order. The operation lost half its mass before crossing the start line. Only the northern group remained. General Pulikovsky took control of the main assault force. 2,700 men, 100 infantry fighting vehicles, 50 tanks. Command relied on the sheer psychological weight of the armor to force a surrender. They split the depleted force. The convoys moved with an interval of just 5 meters between the bumpers of armored vehicles. This precise metric dictated their survival. A distance of 5 meters meant that a single destroyed lead tank instantly and completely blocked the entire column on a narrow street. There was no room to maneuver. Reversing was impossible. The rigid formation turned into a mechanical liability. The 131st Brigade pushed toward the station. The 81st Regiment took a separate avenue toward the presidential palace. Officers received their objectives over the radio. Command issued 0 written orders. The spatial gap between the units eliminated any tactical overlap. They lacked the infantry to secure the flanks. The mathematical parameters of the operation guaranteed a system failure. 2 columns continued advancing along parallel routes without the ability to help each other. But this doomed tactical geometry required human operators. Command assembled these crews in a systemic panic just weeks before the strike. The command structure fractured immediately. Top-tier generals rejected the directive. Elite special forces units formally refused combat orders. Military police executed mass arrests of dissenting officers. Who sat at the levers of these heavy machines? 18-year-old conscripts without basic training. The logistics of deployment collapsed. Following the Soviet dissolution 3 years earlier, the military apparatus degraded into isolated fragments. To build a strike force, the Defense Ministry cannibalized depleted motorized rifle divisions. They extracted random soldiers from disjointed garrisons across the country. They formed consolidated regiments strictly on paper. Conscripts climbed into the cramped troop compartments of armored infantry vehicles. They held rifles they barely knew how to operate. At the armored spearhead, commissioned officers climbed down into the driver hatches of main battle tanks. The degradation of the military machine reached a critical threshold. For a full-scale assault on a fortified capital, the Army could not supply a basic roster of trained mechanic drivers. The ground invasion launched on December 11th. Politicians predefined the objective. The president stated the military would secure the city in exactly 2 hours. Tactical reality did not matter. Urban combat requires heavy suppression fire. But inside the turrets, gunners pulled the triggers on empty coaxial machine guns. A dry metallic click. Ordnance depots never issued the required ammunition for the secondary weapons. Command sent heavy armor into city blocks functionally disarmed against infantry. The columns stopped 12 hours before the new year. Sending these untrained conscripts into the city was no strategic calculation. It was Boris Yeltsin reacting blindly to a catastrophe from exactly 1 month prior. Why launch an assault in such a frantic rush? Politics demanded the immediate erasure of November's disgrace. In 1991, the Soviet Union fractured. Chechnya declared independence. The Republic seized abandoned military arsenals. They formed their own armed forces. Moscow tolerated the standoff for 3 years. Then came 1994. The Kremlin deployed a covert proxy force. Armed units rolled toward Grozny. The goal was a quiet removal of the local leadership. The secret operation failed instantly. Local militias ambushed the unorganized columns. 20 destroyed tanks burned to the ground. Captured Russian tank crews sat with lowered heads. Their bewildered faces were paraded across global television networks. A quiet, covert strike became a worldwide public humiliation. This November disaster was an exact tactical demo of the upcoming New Year's assault. Heavy armor trapped in narrow streets, restricted sightlines, point-blank destruction. Yet the high command completely ignored the glaring signal. Humiliation canceled out military logic. The Kremlin gathered an emergency session. Generals drafted a massive retaliatory strike in sheer panic. They approved a full-scale invasion. The blind march of armored columns in the central Grozny shattered against simple geometry. At 50 meters, the T-72 tank's gun physically could not rise above the 4th floor. Why were the newest tanks left defenseless? They were built for open fields, not for the narrow streets of Grozny. The Chechen fighters understood this flaw perfectly. The gunner pulls the controls. The turret whines. The heavy barrel climbs. A harsh metallic screech cuts through the hull as the elevation ring hits its mechanical limit. The 2A46M smoothbore gun locks at plus 13.5 degrees. The 5th floor remains completely out of reach. A flash cuts through the smoke above. An RPG-7 warhead slams straight into the unprotected roof. T-72, T-80, and BMP crews found themselves trapped in a vertical crossfire. They could not aim high enough for the rooftops. They could not depress their barrels low enough for the basements. External defenses failed completely. The hulls carried explosive reactive armor, but the steel boxes hung hollow. During the hurried winter deployment, technicians simply forgot to pack the explosive inserts into the blocks. Even vehicles equipped with fully loaded Contact 1 systems died fast. The outdated plates could not survive repeated tandem strikes from all angles. Ammunition carousels ignited. The intense pressure ripped turrets from the holes. The lethal jack-in-the-box effect scattered burning steel across the pavement. Infantry sat paralyzed inside the troop compartments. There was no tactical maneuver. The execution was systematic and mathematically precise. The heavy armor burned from a distance of exactly 50 meters. While tank crews scanned blind spots for targets, the open army radio frequency hissed with static. Through the white noise broke a calm voice. Chechen commander Turpal Ali Adkayev bypassed communication protocols. He tapped the channel of the 131st Brigade. He addressed Colonel Savin directly. Alec, just the nickname. They knew each other from the old Soviet Army days. The transcript of this intercept shows no hostility. Adkayev offered a clear exit. He urged Savin to pull the armor out of the city center to avoid a massacre. Both commanders understood the urban geometry. Both knew the trapped columns faced annihilation. Tactical logic dictated an immediate retreat. But the rigid military hierarchy stripped field officers of autonomy. The inflexible system of directives outweighed simple survival. The chain of command completely paralyzed decision-making on the ground. Adkayev survived the battle for Grozny. Russian forces captured him during the Second War. He died in a federal prison in 2002. Colonel Savine did not have years. He listened to the enemy commander. He recognized the hopeless position of his troops. Then Savine formally refused to violate the command's order. Savin's refusal to retreat sealed the perimeter. Motorized riflemen remained trapped. Armor designed for combat support became steel sarcophagi. Conscripts bolted the BMP hatches from the inside. In the cramped troop compartments, untrained soldiers sat paralyzed by shock. Tactical protocol required them to dismount. They had to screen the tanks. They refused. Instinct kept them behind the armor plates. Rebel squads approached the vehicles through optical blind spots. RPG warheads breached the holes at point-blank range. Anyone escaping the burning chassis stepped directly into sniper fire. Wounded Colonel Savin maintained command. He transmitted desperate requests for immediate backup, but analog signals compromised the network. Since Russian vehicles relied on outdated Soviet R-123 radios without encryption, enemy operators monitored every tactical transmission in real time. The technological gap broke the Russian coordination. Rebel units utilized new commercial Motorola handheld radios. These compact devices provided secure and decentralized communication across all combat sectors, granting the defenders absolute operational autonomy. Blind and deaf Russian infantry faced a highly synchronized network. The urban defense grid consisted of 3 concentric rings. Russian intelligence missed this layered geometry. Armored columns had driven straight into the center in parade formation. The New Year ceasefire lasted 15 minutes. The 15-minute ceasefire expired. Instantly, the 81st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment hit a deadlock on Pervomaiskaya Street. The unencrypted radio frequency crackled. 3 words broadcasted to the Russian crews. Welcome to hell. How do you destroy an armored column in minutes? You knock out the first and last vehicles in a narrow corridor, stripping the rest of maneuverability. A rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the lead machine. Metal sheared. Detonation. Seconds later, the rear tank exploded. The trap snapped shut. Dozens of infantry fighting vehicles sat trapped inside the kill zone. The street offered no clearance. Tracks ground against asphalt. Drivers slammed gears into reverse. Hulls collided in the panic. They could not turn around. Thick black smoke swallowed the convoy. Visibility dropped to 0. Mechanics strained their eyes through dirty periscopes. They searched for directions, but Chechen fighters had swapped the street signs before the invasion. Navigators guided their units deeper into the blind alleys. The enemy initiated hug tactics. Infantry closed the engagement distance to 10 meters. They fired down from third-floor windows and up from basement vents. This proximity paralyzed Russian heavy guns. The 81st Regiment could not request artillery support without striking their own armor. Inside the hulls sat terrified conscripts. They possessed no city maps and 0 urban combat training. Outside waited the Abkhazian Battalion. These hardened veterans carried real combat experience and knew exactly where to strike Soviet armor. The firebags multiplied. Further down the sector, the primary assault group of the 131st Brigade fell under intense crossfire. They held the central railway station. This position trapped them directly between 2 concentric defense rings. Armor detonated. Infantry retreated into the terminal building. Incendiary rounds ignited the structure. Command dispatched a second assault group for reinforcement. The tactical gap was 20 minutes. They never reached the station. Ambush units annihilated the relief column en route. The isolation of the 81st Regiment and the 131st Brigade triggered a fatal chain reaction. By the morning of January 1st, the tactical identification system collapsed entirely. 60% of all Russian casualties now came from friendly fire. The military apparatus began to destroy itself. The 131st Support Battalion pushed into the grid to extract survivors. Ambush units erased them before they even saw the train station. The command network dissolved into radio static. Daylight brought close air support. Russian jets and helicopters descended through low clouds to assist the trapped armor. Instead, they struck the western group of forces. Ground command failed to transmit Allied coordinates to the flight crews. Deploying aviation cluster munitions in dense urban architecture with blurred front lines guarantees one outcome: mass fratricide. Hundreds of steel submunitions shredded Allied infantry. Burning armor choked the intersections. Visual identification failed. Both sides drove identical combat vehicles. Both sides carried the same weapons. Panic overrode protocol. The tactical void bred a new tier of chaos. Chechen combatants stripped uniforms from fallen soldiers. Speaking fluent Russian, they bypassed the fragmented defense perimeters. Saboteurs navigated the municipal sewer pipes. They surfaced directly between isolated Russian positions, fired short bursts into both flanks, and dropped back into the tunnels. Paranoia ignited the street. Two Allied units locked onto each other's muzzle flashes. They fed ammunition belts into heavy machine guns and systematically leveled the block. The fratricidal firefight lasted 6 hours. On the night of January 2nd, the commander of the 131st Brigade made a final call. Colonel Savin's decision cost him his life, but it exposed the systemic paralysis of the entire Grozny operation. How did the elite of the armored forces find themselves forced to retreat on foot along the tracks? Brigade control was completely lost. Headquarters provided no extraction coordinates. Savin ordered a breakout under the cover of winter darkness. The infantry moved out. They navigated blindly along the steel railroad ties. The strict command was total silence, no shooting, no illumination. But exhausted nerves broke. The silent march quickly collapsed into disorganized panic in the pitch black. They covered exactly 70 meters from the station. The Chechen fighters held their fire and watched them move. Then, the retreating column stumbled upon 3 stranded infantry fighting vehicles. The armor belonged to the Samara Regiment. Savin seized the mechanical asset. He ordered the heavily wounded loaded into the cramped troop compartments. The commander boarded the lead vehicle. The convoy initiated movement. The supersonic crack of an RPG-7 rocket shattered the forced silence. The shaped charge hit the first BMP instantly. The hull ruptured. Colonel Savin took fatal shrapnel damage. He died minutes later beside the twisted, burning metal of his vehicle. State authorities posthumously awarded him the title Hero of the Russian Federation. High Command actively used this personal heroism to mask the true scale of a total tactical catastrophe. The localized slaughter exacted a massive toll. Chechen forces lost 120 fighters near the station alone. The complete engagement lasted exactly 60 hours. The Russian breakout attempt immediately dissolved into utter chaos. An anti-tank grenade struck the second BMP. The chassis burned out on the street. The third vehicle pushed forward but took a direct hit further down the road. Chechen assault groups systematically destroyed the remaining armor and captured the wandering survivors. 24 hours of absolute logistical paralysis at the railway station dictated Savin's fatal night breakout. By January 1st, the defensive perimeter had become a slaughterhouse. 300 to 350 killed soldiers lay in the concrete ruins. Ammunition crates sat empty. Savin loaded 40 critical casualties onto the last 3 operational vehicles. The convoy rolled out, but the drivers navigated blind in the urban maze. The 3 machines mistakenly headed toward the city center. They drove directly into a prepared RPG ambush. Anti-tank grenades shattered the armor before the drivers could reverse. Only 13 wounded men survived to become prisoners. The medical evacuation collapsed. Enemy assault groups permanently sealed the brigade inside a tight fire bag. Surrender meant immediate execution. The trapped soldiers held the station against point-blank grenade throws. Headquarters monitored the tactical collapse over the radio. Desperate staff officers transmitted a new order. They commanded the trapped troops to take local civilians hostage to negotiate an extraction. This directive directly violated military regulations, proving the High Command operated completely detached from the reality on the ground. The garrison broadcasted the threat over open frequencies. The Chechen commanders never replied. 60 hours of combat broke the 131st Brigade. Their proportional armor losses exceeded the 1945 Soviet assault on Berlin. Why did the heavy vehicles burn so fast? The command sent armored columns into dense city blocks, blind and without infantry screens. The concrete zoning stripped them of maneuverability. By January 3rd, 789 brigade soldiers lay dead. Fire consumed 20 out of 26 main battle tanks. Shattered turrets blocked the narrow intersections. 102 out of 120 infantry fighting vehicles burned down to the frames. Insurgents targeted the air defense first. They completely incinerated every single Tunguska anti-aircraft system on the streets. Charred metal filled the avenues. Across all assault groups, the army lost between 1,500 and 2,000 men in the opening days. Chechen fighters fired RPG-7 rockets from upper floors and basements, striking weak top and rear plating. This statistical disaster proved the absolute unsuitability of Soviet armored doctrine for modern urban warfare. Tanks required dismounted infantry support. The generals ignored the manual. The ground swallowed the casualties. In 2008, construction workers excavated a site in Grozny. City soil hid a mass grave containing the remains of 800 people. Heavy machinery scraped against crushed bone and rusted dog tags. The tactical collapse erased entire command structures. The 1st Battalion ceased to exist as a functional combat unit. The military wrote off 300 men and 40 armored vehicles in a single stroke. The Defense Registry still lists 196 soldiers as missing in action. Recognizing the absolute failure of the armored blitzkrieg, the command radically altered its doctrine. What lesson did the system learn from the death of the brigades? Commanders permanently replaced tank wedges with a total artillery barrage. The tactic shifted to grid coordinates. The density of fire reached 30,000 artillery shells daily, erasing entire city blocks. Expending 30,000 rounds a day demanded an unprecedented logistical strain, turning a quick operation into a protracted war of attrition. Europe had not recorded this level of sustained bombardment since the Second World War. Infantry eventually secured the rubble. The defenders retreated to the mountains, but the control failed. A massive counterattack in 1996 shattered the Russian perimeter. The military withdrew. The paradigm fully shifted in 1999. The second campaign under Vladimir Putin strictly applied the revised military approach. Armor stayed back. Heavy guns leveled the remaining infrastructure. Federal units occupied the destroyed city and installed a strictly controlled regional government.